Motor Carrier Safety Administration has issued an interpretation that the state is bound to follow. We're training our officers, as well as, again, we're responsible for the training of the municipal police officers certified to do these inspections. And we're letting everybody know that there is, in fact, no enforcement on the traditional farm tractor going down the road pulling any type of trailer, any implement, whether it's a farm tractor by itself or it's towing something else at the time. So you want to cover some of the other stuff?
The other thing too, one of the big pieces of misinformation that first came out is that there was going to be the elimination of the exception for drivers transporting agricultural commodities, farm machinery, farm supplies from the CDL requirements. Nothing has changed with the CDL exemption. The CDL exemption as it existed prior to this change is still the same. You know, drivers of farm vehicles operating within 150 miles of their farm, transporting agricultural commodities, farm machinery, farm supplies, are exempt from CDL. They were before, they are now. So there's really no significant change there. As Sergeant Kroll said, we got the okay to have the exemption for operators of farm tractors. That someone driving a farm tractor is not going to be subject to these regulations. That's intended for off-highway use. It's only incidentally operated or moved over the highway, and I know there was a lot of concern about that, particularly since there was an age limitation. Generally, the regulations say that someone under the age of 18 cannot operate a combination vehicle. And there was a lot of concern amongst some of the family farms that this was going to impact the ability to some of the farm children, the 14 to 15-year-olds, from operating those farm tractors. Again, as Sergeant Kroll said, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration gave us an exemption that allows those folks to operate the farm tractors. When we initially drafted the regulations, these certainly were not the anti-farming regulations as some might have been led to believe. There is some impact, but again, these were geared for commercial trucking. However, there is the impact on farming. FMCSA, the feds recently passed a ban on texting by commercial vehicle operators. Because our regs were in such a state of disarray, we as law enforcement here in Pennsylvania had no way to enforce any of those provisions against commercial drivers. We had no way to enforce that anti-texting ban on the drivers. Some of the other things that there were some concerns were about the hours of service and how many hours that farm drivers can operate. I know initially there was some information put out that we were going to now require additional record keeping and limit how many hours you could operate. We all know that farming is pretty much 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365-day-a-year operation anymore. So what they have, one of the things we were able to do by passing these regulations is we have an exemption to the hours of service. That if you operate within a 100-mile radius of your farm and you transport agricultural commodities or agricultural supplies during what's been determined as the planting and harvesting season, you're exempt from the hours of service. Now, planting and harvesting season used to be defined as March through November. The Secretary of both Agriculture and the Secretary of Transportation recognized that, again, farming here in Pennsylvania has become a year-round occupation. So they have moved to make that planting and harvesting season year-round. So it will be January through December. So there is going to be, and it makes sense because that's also what many of our neighboring states also have the year-round planting and harvesting season. So it doesn't create an unfair situation. We're now going to be able to compete with our neighbors in that we also have that year-round planting and harvesting season here in PA. There was also some concern that we're now going to require drivers of farm vehicles to have medical cards. Quite honestly, previous to us changing these regulations, if you drove an articulated vehicle, a combination vehicle, a truck and a trailer, and the combined weights of those vehicles were over 17,000 pounds, you were required to have a medical card before. You're still going to be required that. There's no change to that. If it's a single farm vehicle over 17,000 pounds, didn't require a medical card before, you're not going to require one now. So really, there's been no change in many of those areas. The biggest change, as we see it, are for those farm vehicles that were operating under the biennial certificate of exemption. Previously, those operating under that Type 1, Type 2, Type 3, Type A, B, C, the PennDOT's changed it a couple times, but those that are operating under that exempt registration, they had a blanket exemption before from all these safety regulations, which again, as Sergeant Kroll talked about, that also included some of the equipment items, and that did have some concern for us. So those vehicles are going to be subject to, we want to make sure you have lights at work, tires that are good, brake systems that are good. But you're still going to be granted those hours of services exemptions that you had previously. If it's a single vehicle, over 17,000 pounds, the driver's still not going to have a medical card. There's still the CDL exemption that exists. So really, the only significant change is that they may be required to some of the equipment standards, but they still had to meet lighting, brakes, tires. They still had to meet standards that were in our vehicle code. There's still minimum safety standards that these vehicles had to meet previously that are still going to be what's going to be enforced out there. So there isn't any significant change in those areas. Some other things, Sarge, you can think of?
Yeah, I think you hit the highlights of some of the areas that have been raised as far as issues in the past, or issues during the promulgation of the regulations. The regulations have passed, so everybody knows. They are effective now, and one of the I guess one of the concerns was that there was going to be some new focused, targeted enforcement on the farming community once these regulations went through. And again, didn't start from us, and we oversee the program for the state. Us and some of the office staff back at the office that we work out of. So you will see no difference with the change of these regulations between what was happening before they changed and what's happening afterwards. Certainly, the rules are there. We can't turn a blind eye to any rules or regulations, nor would we or should we choose to. But by the same token, we're not going out tomorrow and starting some, now that we have new regulations, they impact a particular industry, whether it's farming or any other segment, we're not going out just looking to hold specific enforcement operations on that industry to so-called, force them into compliance. We expect, just like with any laws or regulations, that everybody would comply with them as they're written, and certainly, if any entities, and I'm aware there is some proposed legislation already to try to make some various changes within the farming regulations dealing with anything from sizes of vehicles, which has nothing to do with these regulatory changes, to other things within the regulations themselves, looking at maybe going a little bit larger on the types of vehicles. So there's certainly proper ways to go through your legislature and attempt to change laws or regulations should you as a group feel that something is not the way you feel it should be.